Hey guys, welcome to the May 2022 episode of Base. This episode is titled, How Our Money Got Messed Up, and I know I'm about to make every libertarian in my audience super excited because you guys have been begging me to cover this issue all along. I'm not going to lie, monetary policy is not really my favorite subject, but given everything going on recently, I realized it's high time for this issue. So let's jump in. You don't have to be particularly political to have noticed that something is really wrong with the money in the US. If you're a millennial like me, you've probably been particularly jerked around by now, from the housing bubble burst to the Great Recession to the rampant inflation we're experiencing in 22. There's a lot of people who rightfully feel like they just can't catch a break in our country's economy. And make no mistake, that is a violation of something really important. The promise of America was life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And a lot of people get confused on this, so I want to really break it down. I don't believe that people are entitled to much. There's a lot of people running around claiming that they have rights to things that they absolutely do not, like other people's labor. But what you do have are natural inherent rights, and that's to live your life free of oppression. And oppression can come in many forms, which is why this little phrase, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, matters so much. You have a right to your life, to not be killed or harmed. You have a right to your liberty, to not have your freedoms taken away without due process. And you have a right to pursue your own happiness. Note, not to be happy, to pursue your own happiness, which is to work hard to keep the proceeds of your labor, to make something for yourself, to build the life that you want, which is something we often call the American dream. And that's a significant right that historically many people have been denied. And when you think about the elements people need to pursue their own happiness, I think a few elements come to mind from a public policy perspective. You need a fair playing field for the game of life to not be rigged against you. You need to be free of laws that create barriers to your ability to work, earn, and keep your money. And you need economic stability to plan ahead and know how to invest, where to direct your labor, and how to best meet your needs in the short and long term. When I look at the US, none of these conditions for the pursuit of happiness are currently being met. Something sinister is being done to you by your government, and the promise of the pursuit of happiness is being violated because of it. But as I always say on Based, before you can prescribe the right solutions to this problem, you have to understand the root problems, what created it. You really have to understand what the government has done to our money. Now, I did a whole episode of Based on the ways in which the US fails to be a truly capitalist country, so go back and listen to that or watch the episode if you haven't. I don't want to get too sidetracked today. But it is important to remember that capitalism is an economic system. Governments can either support or intervene in capitalist economies through their policies. Our government is supposed to support capitalism, and politicians on both the right and left will claim that they do. But by and large, it is a rarity to find a politician that truly stands for free market capitalism. Democrats and Republicans push policies that actually violate the free market system and the citizens doing business in it every day. And one way they do that is through manipulation of our currency. So let's go back to the beginning and figure out what happened. Now, y'all know I generally like the Constitution. I think it was an excellent first start at creating a new kind of government and political system, and economically, the founders did as much as they could with the knowledge they had at the time. Remember, capitalism was just getting going in 1776. The Wealth of Nations came out mere months before the Declaration of Independence. But the founders did include some fatal flaws in the document that I believe have frankly doomed us and that allowed the government to get its hands on our money in the first place. I always have to put an asterisk here because this unfortunately does not go without saying these days, but the founders do not get the same grace on the moral failings of the Constitution, to be clear. If we were to update the Constitution, which is, by the way, what Thomas Jefferson said that we should do, I think we could build upon the framework that they started with, but there would be some major changes needed to actually restrain the government as intended and to keep politicians' dirty hands out of the market. So what did they do when it comes to the money? Article 1, Section A of the Constitution gives Congress the power to coin money, regulate the value thereof and of foreign coin, and fix the standard of weights and measures. That's a bit of a mouthful, but here's what you basically need to know. From our very inception, the federal government is involved with printing our currency and determining its worth. I've linked a longer history about that timeline in my show notes if you really want to get into the weeds, but I'm going to cover the major points. From 1775 to 1791, to finance the American Revolution, the Continental Congress printed the new nation's first paper money. And these bills were known as continentals. They were fiat money notes, and they were issued in such quantity that they led to inflation, which, though mild at first, rapidly accelerated as the war progressed. Eventually, people lost faith in those notes, and the phrase, "not worth a continental," came to mean utterly worthless. In 1791, Alexander Hamilton, who was U.S. Treasury Secretary under George Washington, establishes the first Bank of the United States to create a system of credit for the government. The bank is the first of several in the country to issue private currencies, facilitating borrowing and lending. And for the record, this was a significant win on the part of Hamilton and the Federalists, who also wanted a strong central government. Thomas Jefferson was afraid that a national bank would create a financial monopoly that might undermine state banks and adopt policies that favored financiers and merchants over debtors. Sounds about right, doesn't it? Now, as Andrew Hill points out, unlike modern central banks, the Bank of the United States did not set monetary policy as we know it today. It did not regulate for other financial institutions, and it did not hold their reserves. Nonetheless, its prominence as one of the largest corporations in America and its branch's broad geographic position in the emerging American economy allowed it to conduct a rudimentary monetary policy. The bank's notes, which were backed by substantial gold reserves, gave the country a relatively stable national currency. By managing its lending policies and the flow of funds through its accounts, the bank could and did alter the supply of money and credit in the economy, and hence the level of interest rates charged to borrowers. That bank's charter expired in 1811, and by that point Hamilton was dead, and as they say in the musical, they didn't have the votes. They couldn't extend the charter. By 1816, the political climate was once again inclined towards the idea of a central bank, though, and by a pretty narrow margin, Congress agreed to charter the second Bank of the United States. But when Andrew Jackson, who was a central bank foe, was elected president in 1828, he vowed to kill it. And his attack on the banker-controlled power kind of touched a popular nerve with Americans, and when the second bank's charter expired in 1836, it was not renewed. In 1834, the United States fixed the price of gold at $20.67 per ounce, where it remained until 1933. And this is what's known as the gold standard. And what it means is that for most of U.S. history, our currency was actually backed by something of value. Every dollar in circulation represented a set amount of gold, which had a determined value. And that's a good thing. You need that for a currency to be stable. 1836 to 1865 is kind of considered the era of free banking. You had state-chartered banks and unchartered free banks, and they took hold during this period, issuing their own notes that were redeemable in gold or specie. I don't really know what specie is, but I think it was their dollar. However, the train started coming off the track pretty quickly. Under Abraham Lincoln in 1862, Congress passes the Legal Tender Act of 1862. Basically, the country was in a ton of debt from the Civil War, and the government had to pay for it. And this act allowed them to print what they called greenbacks, which was paper money that was not backed by gold, which could be used to pay taxes or buy goods from a store. They also passed the National Bank Act of 1863, providing for nationally chartered banks whose circulating notes had to be backed by U.S. government securities. An amendment to that act required taxation on state banknotes, but not national banknotes, effectively creating a uniform currency for the nation. For the next 50 years, you see a lot of financial upheaval and instability. There were depressions. JP Morgan had to come and bail out the federal government at one point. Times were weird. And it led to this growing call for a central banking authority in America. The Aldrich-Vreeland Act of 1908 provided for emergency currency issue during crises. It also established the National Monetary Commission to search for a long-term solution to the nation's banking and financial problems. And in 1913, they thought they had it. The Federal Reserve Act of 1913 is passed, which I promise we will be coming back to. But this legislation, right now, all you need to know is it created the Federal Reserve System we still live under to this day. Though Congress can amend the Fed's charter, the legislation gives this entity broad power to print money and gives a mandate that they keep prices stable and maximize employment. The 7 members of the Board of Governors are nominated by the President and approved by the U.S. Senate. Each governor serves a maximum of 14 years, and each governor's appointment is staggered by 2 years to limit the power of the President. In addition, the law dictates that appointments be representative of all broad sectors of the U.S. economy. We'll leave a pin in that for now. From 1914 to 1918, the gold standard officially breaks down. This was during World War I, which at the time was the bloodiest and most expensive war of all time. And I hope to God by now you're catching up on the fact that money is closely tied to war in this country. U.S. banks continued to operate normally thanks to the emergency currency issued under the Aldrich-Vreeland Act of 1908. But the greater impact in the United States came from the Reserve Bank's ability to discount bankers' acceptances. And through this mechanism, the United States aided the flow of trade goods to Europe, indirectly helping to finance the war until 1917, when the United States officially declares war on Germany, and financing our own war effort became paramount. Then, they basically briefly tried to reinstate the gold standard from 1925 to 1931. They called it the gold exchange standard. And then, of course, comes the Great Depression, and all hell breaks loose. From 1930 to 1933, nearly 10,000 banks failed. And by March of 1933, that monster FDR declared a bank holiday, meaning they wouldn't give people their money, while government officials grappled with ways to remedy the nation's economic woes. Many people blame the Fed for failing to stem speculative lending that led to the crash, and some also argued that inadequate understanding of monetary economics kept the Fed from pursuing policies that could have lessened the depth of the Depression. In reaction to the Great Depression, Congress passes the Banking Act of 1933, better known as the Glass-Steagall Act, calling for the separation of commercial and investment banking and requiring use of government securities as collateral for Federal Reserve notes. And then, in 1934, FDR seized all the gold. No, really. Signed by President Franklin D. Roosevelt in January of 1934, the Gold Reserve Act transferred ownership of all monetary gold in the United States to the U.S. Treasury and prohibited the Treasury and financial institutions from redeeming dollars for gold. Some of y'all still don't believe me when I tried to tell you just how bad FDR was for this country. This stuff is wild. From my colleague, John Miltimore at FEE, FDR's order, Executive Order 6102, forbade the hoarding of gold coin, gold bullion, and gold certificates within the continental United States. Not only would individuals not be able to redeem their paper notes for gold under this order, but private ownership of gold coins and bullion was made illegal. And that unpopular law was repealed, by the way, by 1974. But still, just major yikes. Between 1946 and 1971, countries operated under the Bretton Woods system. Under this system, the US dollar became the world's reserve currency, which foreign governments could redeem for gold, even though US citizens could not. So while this is still pretty messed up, the dollar at this time was at least still tied to gold, even though you couldn't actually redeem your dollars for it. The US promised to redeem gold for other governments at an exchange rate of $35 per pound, and this meant the US couldn't inflate the money supply without depleting its gold reserves. But then comes the Vietnam War. Remember what I told you about war. At this point, LBJ is in office and he wants to escalate this thing and he needs to pay for it. So what do you do when you're just a little US president struggling to live within your means and you want to go bomb little brown kids overseas? You spend it anyways. Between the 1950s to 1971, the US depleted roughly 55% of its gold stock, with the majority of that depletion coming towards the end of the decade. And by 1971, Nixon is in office, the dollar is inflated, the gold is depleted, and he makes a critical decision. He officially pauses gold redemption, effectively ending the gold standard altogether. There is a whole website called WTF Happened in 1971 that I encourage you to check out. And that website has spawned a whole movement of people, even getting recent shout outs from the likes of people like Edward Snowden and Jack Dorsey. Clearly, you know what happened in 1971 because I just told you, whereas the people who are approaching this website for the first time do not. But what you don't know is what all happened as a result, and that is the information this website presents first. Income inequality took off. I'll link to some of these graphs in my show notes for you guys on the audio-only version. Wages, which had tracked closely with productivity and GDP growth for decades, began to lag productivity and economic growth badly. Inflation soared, growing at a faster rate than at any period in the previous century. The income gap between Black and white Americans, which had been closing rapidly since 1950, all but stopped closing. The list goes on. When we left the gold standard in 1971, we became a fiat money system, which all have three components in common. One, the government or its central bank has the monopoly on money production. Two, money is created by way of bank credit expansion, i.e., out of thin air. And three, money has no inherent value. It is simply brightly colored paper or digital bytes that can be produced whenever those in power deem it politically expedient. And basically what that means in the long run is that the government can finance whatever it wants, even when we can't afford it. That's why the federal debt was $398 billion in 1971 and is now $30 trillion, of which $10 trillion was created in the last 6 years alone. And it's no wonder that the 1% now holds a record percentage of all wealth. In creating a fiat money system, we gave these people a blank check that is tied directly to our bank accounts. And once you know these things, you'll understand how things like the Great Recession or our current skyrocketing inflation occur. These events, which have a drastic impact on all of our lives, do not occur by happenstance. They are a direct result of policy choices like stimulus spending and bailouts, which is why some of us, like me, like Thomas Massey, were predicting this inflation at the very beginning of the pandemic when the federal spending first ramped up. Ending the gold standard was part one of the formula that messed up our money and set our currency on its current collision course. Part two is something I mentioned earlier in the episode, the creation of the Federal Reserve. There is no way for me to possibly distill all of the problems of the Federal Reserve into one episode, so I'm going to summarize some of the larger issues with its existence and structure, but I must implore you to do some homework. You've got to read Ron Paul's book, And the Fed. It's been out since 2009. This man is freakishly right about everything, and in it, he does a really excellent job of making a pretty complex financial institution easy to understand. In the book, Paul argues that the Federal Reserve was created to bail out banks when they got into trouble, and he says that this is bad for competition in banking as it strengthens the big banks. Yeah, obviously. Paul also argues that the Fed is both corrupt and unconstitutional. He states that the Federal Reserve System is inflating currency today. Remember, he wrote this book in 2009. It's much worse now. But back then he said they were inflating it at nearly a Weimar or Zimbabwe level, which Paul asserts is a practice that threatens to put the United States into an inflationary depression where the US dollar, which is the reserve currency of the world, would suffer severe devaluation. Sounds like we're on track so far. Additionally, and this is key, Paul says inflation as a hidden tax makes warfare much easier to wage. Because people will reject the notion of increasing direct taxes, inflation is used instead to help service the overwhelming debts incurred through warfare. If you ever, for a second, think that the number one client of the United States government isn't the military-industrial complex, go back to square one and start the game over. As Paul explains, inflation diminishes the purchasing power of the masses, though they often don't even know it. And this is how they keep you poor. Inflation is a regressive tax, meaning it actually impacts poorer people more. The Fed's main goal is to privatize profits and socialize losses. They are not working for you. They are working for the 1%. And you can see proof of this during the pandemic. The Fed made the decision to print a massive amount of new dollars. Just how massive? 80% of all dollars in circulation were printed during this 2-year time period. That means they infused the economy with a huge surplus of dollars, which is a recipe for inflation. When you have more dollars chasing fewer goods, you get inflation. And then on top of that, they did this while the global supply chain had come to a halt and when people were spending less money going out. You will never convince me the current record-breaking inflation we're dealing with wasn't intentional. And notice, it just so happens to be coinciding with a time where a significant number of our leaders are gunning for World War III with Russia. I don't think that's an accident. So now you know how and largely why our money got so messed up in the US. And until we make some massive changes, the economic stressors we live under will continue. These are the reasons ultimately that people lose their jobs or can't hire workers. They determine the value of your savings account and investments. They dictate how much stuff you can buy with the money you earn. As we speak right now, you are currently getting poorer. Your salary is worth far less than it was last year. Your savings are being stolen from your bank account where they sit. The cost of basic services and needs like rent and groceries are becoming unobtainable for those living on the margins. And this is why libertarians call for an end to the Fed and a return to the gold standard. And while yes, those things do feel pretty impossibly out of reach in our current political climate, it's worth pointing out that libertarians have a knack for getting our way in the long run. And that's because we have the truth on our side, and eventually others come around to see it. When we stood up for same-sex marriage in the 1970s, people were still being arrested for who they love. Now, over 70% of the country supports LGBTQ marriages, and it's been legal for almost a decade. When we first stood against endless wars, our representatives were booed, and it was said they hated military members. Now, we've ended Afghanistan with overwhelming support, and Americans and military members are staunchly opposed to confrontation with Russia. We're right about the money, too, and the masses will realize it eventually. But until we get there, many libertarians are prioritizing getting away from the US fiat currency as much as possible and exploring blockchain options like Bitcoin. We can also work to oppose government spending and anti-capitalist policies like corporate welfare, stimulus spending, and bailouts. We can stand against more wars in the military-industrial complex in general. And we can work to educate others about what is being done to them by their government. So, share this episode, leave a comment with what you're doing to spread the message, and until next month, stay based.